Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app and leave a rating or review. Share your favorite episodes with your friends and network. That helps us out a lot, so thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included Michael Frost, J.R. Woodward, and Liam Burns. But today's guest is Andrew Root. Andrew is the professor of youth and family ministry at Luther Seminary, and he is most recently the author of the Ministry in the Secular Age series. His fifth book in that series, Church After Innovation, is out in September. Andy and I have a fascinating conversation about waiting for God to act, sharing stories of community encounter, the importance of prayer, and reclaiming resonance in the accelerated age in which we live. It's really good conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. I know you're going to get a lot out of it, just like I did. So enjoy the conversation. Here's Andy. Andy, welcome. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, as you're working through the ministry and the secular age books, and you're walking through those things, what problem are you grappling with? What's the problem that you see?
Yeah, I think if I was to boil down the problem, it feels like the problem is pretty multifaceted,
Yeah,
obviously.
of
I think
course.
people out there on the ground in ministry right now are feeling kind of bombarded by problems. And of course, after the pandemic, here comes a bunch more problems. But the big problem that's pre-pandemic that I want to deal with that I think maybe is even highlighted more since the pandemic is just how do you in your vocation, whether you're the pastor preaching every week or you're the youth director in the basement or the
Yeah.
children's minister or the associate pastor, doing a bunch of pastoral care, how do you talk to people about a living God in a kind of cultural milieu that forms people just not diabolically or not like forcefully to not want to see God.
Right.
There's almost not even a kind of direct atheistic response.
Yeah.
It just happens. It's just kind of in the air they breathe. And even the
Mm.
most committed kind of people to our congregations can go weeks and sometimes months without thinking about God or forgetting that they need to pray. And that's a very kind of different cultural reality we're
Yeah.
in. And that's probably been with us for quite a bit now, but it seems like it's I don't know, like the chickens have come home to roost in some ways, or it's become more pronounced in certain
Yeah.
ways. Maybe as institutions weaken, and pastoral vocational identity starts to feel like, okay, what am
Mm.
I doing here? What's the point of this? And probably coming on the backside of seeing a lot of quote unquote successful churches lead to just huge amounts of burnout
Yeah.
and forms of spiritual abuse that have arisen from
Mm.
those. And so, I think it's led people to think kind of in the afterglows of late capitalism and kind of Silicon Valley, like, okay, if the pastor isn't a great, startup entrepreneur, what is the
Yeah.
pastor? And
Yeah.
can I go back to the pastor, someone who helps people pray and think about a living God? Is that even possible?
Yeah. I mean, that's a fantastic question. And it's also a question of, how do we see the world? What's our worldview? If we have a view of the world in which, say, the self, I am God, even though we may not overtly say that, it just naturally is that. It's all about us. It's all about the self. It's all about us trying to propagate something, and to try to use all of our muster to get something out of this world. If we're seeing the world in a view like that, what does it look like? What does the congregation, what does the church, the community of God look like with one another then?
Yeah, I think that becomes the real challenge for us because I agree with you that the self has been forced to carry more weight than probably this is a big statement that I can't verify like anthropologically or something, but maybe more than in any other time in human history. Like
Yeah.
the self has to bear a lot of weight. Now,
Mm.
part of that comes out of just the realities of Augustinian theology and the Reformation, which put a lot of weight on the self too.
Yeah.
Like you're the one who reads the Bible. You're the one who goes before a holy God and prays the confession. Like
Mm,
you do this. So that puts a lot of weight on the self, but not this kind of way. Like
mm,
for us, I think as late modern people, we start to feel like there really is no meaning outside of us.
mm.
That any
Yeah.
meaning we can find in the world has to be constructed internally. We have to
Mm,
discover it in ourselves. And that's a very different reality to live in, where
yeah.
we don't necessarily assume there's a whole lot, or maybe for some people, even any meaning outside of us. And
Mm,
that's
yeah.
just chaos or frustration
Mm,
or horizons to conquer or something. But really, any meaning we'll have will be discovered internally.
wow.
That's tough. And it's tough to do ministry in that context because, well, especially in any kind of Protestant kind of form too, where, this Protestant form of putting weight on the self. Like the self is the one who reads the scriptures. The self can go before
Mm,
God. It doesn't need a priest to mediate this. It also had the assertion that balanced this, that the self was sinful and broken and
yep.
needed something outside the self to save the self. And now we kind of assume that the self does save its own self,
Mm,
and particularly
mm,
saves itself from meaninglessness and boredom. So the big question is, how do we free our people? How do we help people? I mean, the crazy thing about this, then, which is hard to talk about, is that obsession with the self, that almost making the self its own God, like you're
yeah.
saying, and carrying the weight of all meaning and purpose, there's a certain way that it's become so easy then to turn on the self and hate the self. So we have this
Mm,
really strange
yeah.
culture where people just, you just go onto Instagram or TikTok and people are just all about themselves.
Yeah.
There's nothing but me, 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 me. Or you watch reality TV, and you hear these people just talking about me, 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 me all the time. And yet the same people who can be all me, me, me can just turn on themselves and hate themselves too.
Mm,
Like utterly have let themselves down and, have to compete for anything else. It looks like everyone else is being able to find meaning within themselves, but I can't. So there's this kind of whiplash of like over glorifying yourself, which, well, it
yeah.
leads to a fetish, and
Yeah.
fetishes are magical objects that never fulfill. So you end up
Mm,
hating your fetish as much as you want your fetish. And
wow.
so the self becomes a kind of fetish that can't save in any way. And so we have to find a way, I think, in pastoral ministry, particularly, is how do you free people from the idolatry of the self
Mm,
without that leading them to like hate themselves or
mm,
to become masochistic in some way? Like
wow.
how does the gospel itself, which I think it really does, leads us to relativize the self under God's own act and being, but it leads us back to love ourselves, but love ourselves not in the power of our own self, but in the very reality that Jesus Christ has come, died,
Mm,
rose again, and
yeah.
and called yourself into life. Like
Yeah.
that. That's a very different reality. So to me, that becomes the real challenge. And I'm not sure I even got to your question, but that was a rambling mess
But
of an answer.
it's good. It's a big challenge. So, what does it look like? Can we actually get to a place where we see something outside of ourselves? And I think even a lot of people within Christendom, which I don't know how much Christendom is left, but in the Christian world, they don't see it. They're blind to this self propagation, and they think that they're talking God, and God is outside of themselves. They're encountering Him somehow, but it's really they're trying to create or make God into their own image instead of us being made into the image of God. Um,
Yeah.
so, what are some ways that we could start to help people see what is going on and get them to back to a place where we could
Yeah.
encounter God again?
Yeah, I mean, for really central for me, and to be completely honest, this comes, completely out of my own theological commitments and,
Yeah.
my own kind of Lutheran early Reformed kind of commitments. But there is really something central to me about the theology of the cross,
Mm,
and the theology of the cross as a way of really interpreting how it is that God acts and moves in the world, which I think is true for Luther. Like it isn't just purely a kind of doctrinal assertion, it is a practical assertion of
mm,
this is how this God moves in the world. And that if you're going to find this God, you have to find this God um, in suffering and in loss.
mm,
There's this kind of echo of this kind of Pauline theology that it's kind of in a death experience, in the being being knocked to the ground on the road to Damascus,
Yeah.
being in Judas's house in the street called Straight, like in Acts 9, that when everything is wiped away, when everything you
Mm.
thought you were supposed to do, when that all gets wiped away, you realize or you find the God who takes what is dead and makes it alive moving in
Mm.
your life. So that becomes a very different dynamic where instead of ministry being about kind of self-help, how do we optimize your greatest self?
Yeah.
It really becomes about really practically how do we form communities where people can confess a death experience,
Hmm.
confess the places where they're lost, the places where they just by circumstance are lost, like someone in their family is deeply sick and
Hmm.
they need God to act in that, or have gotten themselves lost chasing after all sorts of other goods that have
Yeah.
been nothing but bad and not good. But how do we invite people to kind of narrate those experiences?
Mm.
So to me there's something about, at least from one reading of kind of Paul and Luther and is and even like someone like Bonhoeffer, is that there's this assertion that the first move of the self is to surrender in confession. There's a kind of move towards
Mm-hmm.
confession. And again, that we have to be really careful doesn't turn into kind of a spiritual abuse too, where we ask
Yeah.
people to confess so we can have power over them. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a kind of form of confession that is a certain vulnerability that is narrated to a community that allows us to all share in each other's lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my theological kind of novel idea, or what I've tried to push, is to think about God as always a minister, that God is
Yeah.
primarily a minister. So the God we know is a God who acts in the world, and how this God acts and what this God acts for the sake of is to minister to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so to share in this God's being, we have to share in this God's act. So when we do really minister to our neighbor out of their experiences of loss and death, and where the self finds itself at its limit, that there is a way that the divine breaks into the human. There is a way that Jesus Christ is present acting. There's a way that we can testify to the God of Israel taking what is dead and making it alive.
Wow.
So that's the way I tend to try to think about it.
Yeah. Death and resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And a daily death and resurrection, and it's combined in both. The death and resurrection are combined together, and it's beautiful things. We're walking with others through that, and we're going through that as well as figuring out how could we actually die to ourselves daily, and come back to life and see and have life in Christ. You know, in my circles that I run in, there are a lot of people that I run a lot of mission circles, church planting circles. So there's a lot of outward action and activity. They're being busy to justify their own existence. You know, and you're grappling with with Taylor and Bonhoeffer and Barth and all these theologians as you're walking through them. What are some implications for mission and church planting that you have gleaned from that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really kind of counterintuitive thing that I'm more and more committed to. As you set it up, it is just kind of where I've been going. Is this There is this real push to be busy and to kind of
Yeah,
justify ourselves through busyness. And I think there's a way of realizing that we individually need to kind of confess for that reality, but there's also just a way that the larger structures of our society just push that upon us. And really what it means to be modern people in many ways is to have this kind of conception that things can be sped up and
mm,
things can go faster, and that the best way is the fast way,
yeah,
so um but the problem with that is that we can start to go so fast, and we tend to go so fast that we can really find ourselves alienated from the deeper things of life. Like this is, to me, it's, we talked about how outside of ourselves there can be no meaning. Like that's
yeah,
only really possible if we end up going at such a speed, or the whole of society and the kind of structural realities, particularly of the Western world, start to go so fast that almost all the life gets sucked out of it
yeah,
for kind of instrumentalizing everything to go faster and to accrue and to do more, and to grow, to grow, to grow, to grow. And no one should feel bad about growth, or no one should be against growth, but we do also have to recognize that not all growth is good. Like
yeah,
cancer is a growth that is not good, that
yeah,
that 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 kills. And so I think sometimes what's happened to us in the midst of our kind of feeling haunted by ghosts of decline, or therefore needing to kind of justify our positions, is that we kind of run to these models that were been given through economic structures and just other institutional structures of modernity, which is to look at how we stabilize ourselves, as the sociologist Hartman Rosa says, dynamically. So how growth becomes what stabilizes us.
Yeah.
So if you have a mission startup, the only way to really justify the mission startup is that it should be growing. Someone would have the
Yeah.
numbers like 15, 20% annually in members and giving dollars. And if it's not, if it's let's say it's growing at a 6% or 7% clip,
Yeah.
then really, should the denomination or the network invest in that church plant? I don't know. Like when it comes to a company, like flat growth is death.
Yeah.
It's almost better. Your investors will be almost more okay with you to just go down in a blaze of fire and crash than to be growing at 1 or 2%. No one,
Mm.
no investor wants that. Like that's
Yeah.
that's nothing. They'd rather you swing for the fences and lose everything than just grow at 1 or 2%. But I think that gets transferred to how we think even about ministry, and
Yeah.
what that ends up doing is just burning us out, and it ultimately leaves us unable to do the thing that I think God calls us to do, which is to wait on God.
Mm.
The God of Israel is a very interesting God. This God says about God's self in the scriptures really is this assertion that I'm an acting God,
Yeah.
and you have to wait for me, and
Mm.
you have to wait for my action. Well, in a late consumer society, my gosh, like Homer Simpson has taught us that waiting is the death of everything. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like we're trying to
Uh-huh.
get all the waiting out of life. And yet I think at the deep core of ministry and of discipleship is learning to wait and to
Mm.
wait on this God. And so, are there other rubrics to even think about a
Yeah.
church plant or something like that? Like what are the narratives of life coming out of death here?
Yeah.
And is it possible you could be at flat growth or even uh, a little bit
Mm.
decline on growth, and yet you have these incredible narratives of the Spirit moving, of Jesus Christ
Yeah.
moving in your community, of life coming out of death. And um, too often, and I know it in the traditions I work in, is that those narratives don't matter as much as the fact that you're making your budget, more people are
Yeah.
coming than last quarter, and on it goes.
Well, it's sad, and also what it does right now is it's pushing all my buttons. Like I don't know if I could just sit and wait for God to
Yeah.
act. Like
Okay.
I don't know if I could do that. I would like to do that, and I want to figure out how do I do that well, and how do I do that with purpose and meaning, and seeing life coming out of death. But how do I do that? How do we do that practically in a way where I don't feel like I'm wasting my life? And I'm talking through uh, this imminent frame, right? This worldview
Right.
that says, "Hey,
Yeah.
it's about the self."
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you can see how that plays in. Like if you have to sit and wait and do nothing, and the self gets bored, and it's
Yeah,
even kind of more existential than, just like I don't like this movie, it's boring. But like boredom, feeling like that your own action is trapped or unable to go, all of a sudden makes you feel like you have no purpose, you have
yeah,
no identity, and it becomes a kind of existential crisis. I do think, that we do have to be aware that there are different kinds of waiting.
hmm
You know what I mean? Like it's really hard. I suppose there are people out there, and God bless them, but it's really hard. Like when your flight is delayed and you're sitting in an airport and you have to sit there for an hour and a half waiting to board. It's pretty hard to find that as a spiritual space. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like that kind of waiting just pretty much 99.9% of the time sucks. And
yeah,
there's probably some real true mystics, spirituality people out there who can, start praying for people who are waiting. I tend to look at people and think you are annoying to bleep out of me. Get me on my plane. I want to go. So there is a kind of waiting that just feels like being stuck. Yet there also is a kind of waiting where it feels like you're in time and it's full.
mm,
It's full of something. But I think the difference in that kind of waiting is the kind of narrative that forms you in your waiting and what you're anticipating. So when I'm waiting for a plane and it's delayed, I have no real story that's framing my waiting. My waiting just
mm,
feels like the most inconvenient
mm,
thing there is, and I feel really trapped and annoyed, and therefore I hate all
mm,
other people because they're keeping me from my goal of moving on. But when we wait with a story, you can see there's a kind of theme of
yeah,
story here. It's a different kind of waiting. So one of the things I say in the book, Churches in the Crisis of Decline, is that we have to wait with a watchword. And this is what's kind of interesting thinking about mission startups and
Yeah.
congregations and things like that. We always say you better have a mission statement. Like, what's going to make your church different?
Yeah.
How are you gonna compete for all those resources and all that relevance in your community? And I'm not against that. I think that probably at some level any institutional structure needs that. And churches and mission startups are institutional structures, and they need that. But what's crazy or what's wild is we've had a ton of mission statement work in Protestantism over the last 30 years and almost no watchword work. And by a watchword, I mean a kind of shorthand story that encompasses the life of the community, of how God has shown up in this community, and a way that this God has moved. And so we actually call our people, I think, to wait, not with empty hands, but wait with a story that's really based in Scripture, but also based in the experience this community has had of God moving, and God acting. So the kind of waiting really practically we have to do is with this kind of story, with the watch where we're waiting attentive for God to act. When I'm at an airport, I'm not waiting for anything except that gate agent to say, we're boarding now and we're giving you 10,000 miles for your inconvenience. Like, that's the only thing that can appease me. You know what I mean? Is to kind of be given something for free, where the kind of waiting I think God calls us to is to really wait with a story, wait with a lens, wait with a way of trying to interpret how this God, wait really on our toes, waiting for this God to act and to move. But this is the imminent frame thing. If we don't think God really acts and moves, if we think the triune God is just an idea and not one who acts in history and acts in the world, then you should just hurry up and try to build a really religiously successful church or initiative inside a shrinking religious marketplace. But if we really believe this God acts and moves, and that the church is ultimately God's, and that God is ministering in the world, then we wait on our toes for this God to act and move. And sometimes we wait longer than others, but there's a certain kind of faithfulness. The waiting is trying to see, trying to hear.
Wow. Yeah, I love that, and telling the story of God moving and acting in our community and what that has been. And I remember when we were waiting to get pregnant and waiting for a son, and we were trying so hard. We lost a baby very early, miscarriage, and it took 5 years. But while we were waiting, there were stories of others that God was faithful in the midst of things. There were stories that we were able to share. I was working on the border of Syria with Syrian refugees during that time, and so that was really the only time of connection and empathy that we could have, is saying, hey, we're waiting on a child. We have had this loss here, and we're waiting here, and we're waiting for God to act and move so that we could see new life. And they were in the same position, in the same circumstance, a different one, where they lost their home, and a lot of people lost family members, and they're sitting, as refugees, and they're waiting for new life to come. And those were some of the most powerful moments for us, as we can actually relate one to another, saying, hey, we have this loss, but we know that God has been faithful in the past. We have heard the stories of God's faithfulness, and we want to see God work again. And we know that he's going to act at some time, and we're going to see some life. And so that was a really powerful moment of us waiting with one another. And so it was so helpful to us to have that thing, to be able to do that with other people, and not just try to be these nice little Westerners coming in saying, I have all the answers, and right. I'm going to make your life great again.
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that's a beautiful story.
Thank you. But so I think that because of the self and propagating the self, you say, we become masochists. But really, a lot of things, what's happening now, I think, in culture is we get into the place of depression and anxiety because we're trying to say, all right, I'm going to take care of myself, and I really can't. And so I get depressed. I'm anxious. I'm not going to be able to make it through the day. How can we deal with cultural anxiety and depression in this age?
Yeah, I mean, it is really a huge question, and one of the theorists that I deal with, and I think it's the Congregation book, is a guy. It's a Parisian thinker named Alan Ehrenberg, which does not sound very like Parisian, like that you
No.
would run into him on the streets of Paris or something. But I guess that's what his bio says. But he's written this really great book called the Weariness of the Self,
Mm.
and it's better in its French translation. And I'm not going to actually say it in French and humiliate myself and
You can try.
mispronounce it.
It's all right.
But the direct French translation, it is the fatigue of being yourself is the title of
Mm.
this book. The
Wow.
direct translation, the
Yeah.
fatigue of being yourself. And his point is that there is something about kind of late 20th century, late modern world that depression has become the real ailment that we deal with.
Yeah.
And it just becomes endemic and it is everywhere across particularly upwardly mobile societies that depression is there. And he thinks what depression is, which I find really fascinating, is he does not think it's a pathology of happiness, which is
Mm.
sometimes how we think about it. Like
Yeah.
when you're depressed, you can't be happy. And isn't that terrible? He doesn't think that. He thinks it's actually a ailment of change.
Mm.
And what he thinks occurs is that there becomes this demand on the self to continue to perform, to continue
Mm.
to curate the self, to continue to kind of assess the self's value next to all these other selves that are doing their own project. That your self becomes its own project that you're tending to all the time.
Yeah.
And when you run out of energy for that, when you take too many L's as opposed to W's on that,
Yeah.
when you just don't have the energy to change and change again,
Mm.
and keep up with all this, that you find yourself in a kind of state of despondency and
Yeah.
in a state of depression. So there's this deep sense. I mean, I wish I had like practical things that we can do, but from a larger kind of congregational perspective, is we just have to recognize and we have to think beyond the performative self. Like,
Mm.
how do we think about the self in the relation? This is again why I think the cross is so important, that the self really matters, but
Yeah.
the self finds itself by losing itself. And the self, Paul says, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The self that Paul knows is now the self that is dead and made alive
Yeah.
in Christ. Very different than I have to optimize myself, see how many likes I can get,
Right.
like continue to can work on my resume so I can get another job and keep advancing and going and going. And then I feel all this regret and guilt because I should have finished that degree, or I should have, I should
Yeah.
have done this with my life, or if I was just more interesting and could start a podcast that everyone listened to,
Yeah.
like this podcast, then I would be doing well. Or you go to a dinner party and everyone's talking about New York Times articles, and you're like, why can't I be the kind of self who reads the New York Times? You're like, I don't have time for that, and
Yeah.
you can't keep up. Everyone's talking about how they ride their Peloton bikes, and you're like, man, I can't even take a walk around the block. And so you can start to feel really guilty that your performance is bad. So there is this way we have to kind of think about how the self really knows itself in these kind of vulnerable moments
Mm.
of confession and surrender. But I also really worry that fatigue, that too fatigued to be a self, can get imposed on the church itself.
Yeah.
And I think we have a lot of churches. So I've talked to pastors around the country who they would say that their church is depressed. Like, not
Mm.
the people in the church. I mean, there are people in their
Yeah.
church that feel that, but maybe not everybody. Maybe not even 50% or 30%. But the church as an entity, as a kind of collective reality, just feels depressed.
Hmm.
Like, people just don't have the energy to
Yeah.
help out. And I think a lot of pastors after the pandemic, my wife is actually a pastor of a small church, and she feels that, like,
Yeah.
the whole system of people kind of pulling on the rope together, that all got interrupted.
Yeah.
And now, since coming back from the pandemic, she's had to do way more work than she
Mm.
did before, because people just are out of practice. People are exhausted,
Yeah.
and people kind of feel like yeah, they feel there's a kind of depression that
Mm.
hovers over them. So that's one of the things I really worry about as we kind of think about how the church needs to change to keep up.
Yeah.
So we have to be very careful. And if we can't learn to wait and wait on God and have a kind of horizon that we're seeking for God's own act and being, then it will lead us to just try to do more with less.
Yeah.
And trying to do more with less will turn us into performative congregations that will eventually burn us out and depress us,
Mm.
and we'll be too fatigued to be church, which seems to be, to
Yeah.
me, a deeply theological problem if
Yeah.
we're too
Yeah.
fatigued to be church.
Yeah, that's a big problem. It's a really big problem to have. And it's not the problem of trying to keep up in our accelerated age. Like we're accelerating, we're getting faster and faster, and there's more change. So that means that we're more fatigued, right? That means that we're trying to perform more, that we're changing more quickly. We're changing every 6 months now. We have people that I'm saying, hey, I was at a friend's house last week in Denver, and she's been asking all of her friends, "Can you, uh, do you have the energy? Can you plan for this fall? Are
Hmm.
you able to actually have plans this fall?" And she said, almost everybody, they're all in ministry, pastors, some sort of ministry people, and almost entirely every single one of them said, I can't plan. I have to go week by week. And it's because we know that things are going to change so fast that we're
Yeah.
already fatigued. And I don't know if something is going to change this fall. Like people just have a sense like, oh, the world is going to be different than it is right now, or that I'm done. Like
Yeah.
have too much fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really hard. It's really hard to know. Like it feels really hard to know. Maybe we all do sense that, or maybe we're kind of traumatized by it all, that we think
Yeah.
that, it's gonna change next week, like yeah, I don't know how you felt around just even like planning vacations and getaways. It's like, you used to be able to really depend on that. And
Yep.
now you're like, yeah, we're going unless someone tests positive, and
Exactly.
and so we all kind of feel that. But I just think people are just really deeply tired and
Mm.
fatigued. And I think in most congregations in ministry life, the paid ministry person has had to carry that weight.
Yeah.
And they're already exhausted and they're fatigued to come into this. But their lay leadership is just also exhausted and also fatigued. And yeah, it becomes a big problem.
So, is there anything that you've seen as people are wrestling with this that we could cut through the fatigue and get to the root problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, there's no easy answer, but the big thing we have to guard from, I think, is not allowing all our relationships. And this even comes when you feel like, oh my gosh, no one's helping out, and we
Yeah.
have Sunday school to do, or we said we were going to do this thing, and now no one's signing up. Um, is we just have to really guard against instrumentalizing every relationship.
Hmm.
So in other words, like I'm going to call these people,
Hmm.
and I'm going to see how they're doing, and I'm going to take them to coffee because I really, really, really need them to teach fifth grade Sunday school. You know what I mean? Like where every relationship we have is to kind of win something down the
Hmm.
road.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be really careful of that, because I
Yeah.
think that is what burns people out and burns us out. And so, like again, to quote Hartmut Rosa, one of the things that I've tried to dialogue with is Rosa's point is, in this accelerated age, it really does lead us to alienation, and alienates us from one another.
Yep.
It alienates us from God. It
Hmm.
alienates us from things that speak to us, like art and beauty, and things like that.
Yeah.
We miss it all because we're just going too fast, and everything feels kind of lifeless. And this is
Hmm.
that depression thing again. He says, like,
Yep.
it can feel like, especially when you're depressed, you feel like this, but even when you're just know you're being burnt out, you feel like the live wire between you and the world has been cut off. Like
Yeah.
there's there's nothing there. That you just
Yep.
everything feels dull. And so he thinks that, though, he thinks we do have these other kind of relationships in the world that aren't just instrumental, and he calls them resonance. These kind of experiences
Hmm.
we have where we feel time becomes full and we feel connected to something bigger than us. We feel actually taken out of ourselves, where
Yeah.
ourself doesn't really matter, but ourself is also deeply included. Like it's
Mm.
this kind of sense where there's something more than the self, but the self also is treasured. The self is relativized and yet honored in some way. We have these experiences when we see something beautiful, or when
Yeah.
someone really cares for us. And so I guess I I I don't know exactly how to do this, but there's got to be a way that the kind of action we think about kind of forming our people into, and that we take on as leaders in ministry, is more resonance action than
Mm.
acceleration action. And
Mm.
the props the pastors that have gotten the most props, the ministry leaders that have gotten the most pats on the back, tend to be those who have ridden the wave of acceleration,
Yeah.
not that have
Yeah.
necessarily, in small ways, in subtle ways, created this environment of resonance in their community. But if we become so busy that we can't even hear a poem speak to us, or the
Mhm.
beauty of a 5-year-old who asks a question, then they're inside the immanent frame. There is no
Mhm.
way we'll be able to hear the living God speak,
Wow.
So
Yeah.
part of being formed to hear the living God speak to us again is to have a different kind of relationship to the world. I mean,
Mm.
if God is speaking within the world, then, like I said, the watchword makes us attentive to how God might be acting and moving in the world. Then we need to engage the world not as a kind of innate object we're trying to extract resources out of, but as a place to connect and connect deeply
Mm.
with one another, and with deeper stories, and with beauty, and with truth. And I think we need to point our people to that, and that will
Yeah.
mean some slowing down. It will mean
Mm.
some slowing down, but slowing down without resonance won't be enough either.
Yeah.
We've all had that experience where we've gone on vacation and slowed down, and then it just feels worse because that inbox is just
Yep.
overflowing with emails, and you now have to work 3 times harder the next week after your vacation to make up for the vacation you took.
Mm.
Why really rich people who can go really fast just bring their administrator along with them on vacation, so they never get behind those emails. But most of us can't afford that,
That's right.
form an administrator, let alone taking them on our vacation with us.
Exactly, exactly. And so, as we're walking, have you found a posture that we could take to be able to go slow in this fast world where we actually can engage with others, engage the culture, but not get burnt out by trying to perform enough to keep up?
Yeah. Yeah, the posture I think that we need to take, and this seems is going to seem very pietistic, and some people will probably roll their eyes, but we do really have to learn again to pray,
Mm.
and what it means to be people who pray.
Mm.
And again, and not allowing our prayers to become instrumentalized. Let's pray
Yeah.
this way so God does this for us. Let's
Mm.
leverage our prayers to make God do this. But what does it mean to actually pray, to commune with God, to wait and
Mm.
be? And I just think that leadership right now, what it really needs to be in the context of our moment, is it really needs to be at the center. How do you teach your
Mm.
people to pray?
Yeah.
What does it mean to teach your people to pray?
Mm.
How does your community, and even as it gathers, become a place of prayer where we
Mm.
tell our stories as prayers and we pray our stories? And it really is about kind of gathering and telling stories of how God has acted and moved in our
Mm.
lives, or how we need God to act and move, and we feel like God has abandoned us, that we're lost. I mean, there's places for lament in this too.
Yeah.
But again, that's a kind of disposition of prayer too, of what it means to narrate our experiences. And yeah, I know it seems really kind of simplistic, but I think it's really important if
Yeah.
we think what I do as a leader in ministry, what I do as a pastor, is I teach people to pray. I
Mm.
invite people to pray.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know it probably is not the sexiest thing ever, but I do think it's a way to move inside the immanent frame, to kind of escape from that acceleration, and to
Mm.
seek resonance, and to see and hear the living God move again.
Yeah, and we can't just teach people to pray. We have to be people of prayer ourselves.
Absolutely.
And if we just go out and say, "I want to get my congregation, my people to pray more," I'm going to teach them how to pray, and you're not living it yourself, and you're not a person of prayer. It's not going to work, and people will feel that as well.
Yeah.
And that's also a performative type of thing when we're saying, hey, I'm going to teach you, I'm going to do this, you're going to get it, and I'm going to outsource prayer, and we can't
Right.
outsource prayer.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I don't think, I don't know who would admit this, but probably so many pastors have felt in the last few decades like, I don't have any time for prayer.
Yeah.
Like there's no time to pray. And I always try to tell my own students, which I don't know, they probably feel under the burden of this, but Gregory the Great, the bishop, in the early Christian tradition, used to say to his priest, as he was ordaining them, he said, "You better not. whatever you do now that I'm ordaining you, you're going into ministry, you better not become too busy,
Mm.
because your job, a big part of your job, is to contemplate the Trinity. So don't
Mm.
get too busy so you can contemplate the Trinity. And I always say to my own students, like, try that with your next personnel committee. Like, I need about 15, 20 hours a week so I can just contemplate the Trinity.
Uh,
And you'd get some very strange looks, from your denominational
uh,
officials and from your own congregational personnel committee. But
uh,
maybe it's not that far away from what we actually need,
yeah.
to be in this place to contemplate and pray. I don't know. I think there's a time back to a more mystical experience here of
Mm.
seeking for God in prayer and in some ways in silence.
Yeah. I think that's pretty huge and key, centering prayer of, just sitting in silence with God, and just being there with Him,
Yeah.
is, we often think that, hey, I'm going to have to find the words to say, and I'm going to
Yeah.
say, I got to say this thing, this thing, this thing, and I need to get God to act. Or
Right.
instead of saying, okay, I just need to shut up, and be in His presence and let Him
Yeah.
minister to me
Right.
in the midst of whatever I'm going through. And I don't need to say the words. There's no
Right.
words that I need to say. I just need to be with God in the midst
Yeah.
of this.
Yeah, and that's exactly where you're kind of getting with your point, that it's how we form ourselves too.
Mm-hmm.
If prayer is instrumental, then you can just go to a bookshelf and give people a curriculum to pray. But if prayer is kind of silence before the God who is God,
Yeah.
you can't teach people how to sit in silence if you don't do it.
Yeah.
And it is practicing with people, and how do we practice that with people? And so but again, I understand why everyone feels like, how would I have time to
Yeah.
even sit and listen for God and sit in God's presence. But I think it's really necessary now
Yeah.
more than ever.
Yeah. That's huge. It's huge. You have a new book coming out soon, right? Can
Yeah.
you tell me anything? What are you working on now? You have a new book every couple months, right? So
Well, maybe not that quick, but it is a sickness. I will admit that it's a sickness. I tell my wife I'm a good existentialist in certain ways. Like, I'm miserable when I'm writing, but I'm more miserable when I'm not. So, just it's really more for me than anyone else. So I'm just very thankful that anyone has read them at all. But yeah, there's a book coming out at the end of September, I think, early October, called "The Church After Innovation," which is
Mm,
really kind of, well, it is continuing this Ministry in a Secular Age series,
yeah.
and it's looking at kind of work and how what it means to work inside a secular age, and how work has been kind of transformed in late modernity, and particularly looking at the Protestant obsession with kind of innovation,
Mm,
and particularly kind of Silicon Valley innovation, which I touch on in the Congregation of Secular Age, but kind of
yeah.
take deeper here. And every well, I shouldn't say every, but a lot of kind of Protestant institutions I know are pretty obsessed with trying to become innovative places,
Yeah.
and undergraduate.
100%.
And there's some good reasons for that, and then there's also some things we should be aware of,
Hmm.
and some ways that it's a very odd reality that, especially again, and to not keep saying the Protestant, blowing on the Protestant horn here, but there is a way that Protestantism really thought your Christian life, especially Reformed Protestantism, your Christian life was lived out in the way you worked.
Yeah.
So if Max Weber's correct, there's a way that belief, the kind of belief in a God, creates capitalism,
Mm,
not just economic realities. It's that you wanted to live faithfully before God, and the way you showed you live faithfully before God was to work hard and to
yeah.
reinvest money, and kind of to work for a little extra money, but then reinvest that in the system. But we're in a really weird time where it used to be that the way we thought about our faith kind of filtered in, it spilled into how we thought about what it meant to work.
Mm,
And now there's a weird way that the way we think about work, particularly kind of permanent innovation
mm,
of Silicon Valley, has washed back into the church. And
yeah.
now we're thinking that the best forms of ministry, that the best congregations look like Silicon Valley startups. And I'm just trying to say, well, let's think about that.
Yeah.
Let's think about where this all comes from. And um, I do think maybe we should really hold on to some innovation practices that we've been given, but let's be really clear where
Mm.
they come from, and where they rest before we jump in and fully. So that's kind of the book.
Great. Do you talk a little bit, think about the theology of work, work is worship, and that realm, and what are your quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. But you know, where I ultimately go theologically, and this is a kind of good full circle for us, is to the self.
Mm,
Because I think that the way work is structured now, one of the ways that it is evolved is it's glorified creativity. Like if you worked in a corporation in the 1960s, no one thought you were doing anything creative. I
yeah.
mean, you know, like you think of those episodes of Mad Men at the first season of Mad Men, where the creative wing, the art department, like they were completely ostracized,
Yep.
and they no one cared about them. But now this weird thing's happened where we really do glorify creativity, and we kind of think design
Mm,
and creativity will solve everything, and people have a lot less protections at their jobs. You know, their jobs are. We talked about the fluidity of
yep.
everything. Like people's jobs are really fluid, and that accelerates their lives. But what people tend to get is a way to kind of work on their self
Mm,
at work because of the way creativity
mm,
functions. So the advantage you get in all this flexibility, which corporations need to have permanent innovation, is you also get this sense of personal development you get to work on.
yeah.
So the manager is no longer a manager managing a complicated system. The manager is your coach as you and a small team work on some kind of project, you
Yep.
know. And so it really does the advantage you get for less kind of protections when it comes to insurance and job security and things like
Mm,
that is you get to creatively work on yourself. Well, that's all good, but it also creates this obsessive self culture we have.
wow.
So what I try to do theologically is return to the kind of the German Rhineland mystics who impacted Luther, who think very differently about the self, and to think the self must lose. You kind of have to lose yourself to find
Wow.
yourself,
Yeah.
and try to return to that, and kind of think about work not as this creating the self, but this way of honoring God and
Mm,
like you said, worship
yep.
and things like that. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Great. Beautiful. A couple questions here at the end. One, if you could go back to
yeah.
your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
What I give to my 21-year-old self, this is going to be completely inconsistent with everything I've said, but I would say invest in Google. No. I
That would be good.
yeah, it would be good. No, I what would I say to my 21-year-old self? I think I don't know. I would I think I would say um yeah, just hang in there. Just keep reading. Keep
Mm,
uh yeah, and really that it's always important to continue to seek for the living God in the world, and uh that the church is more important than you. I think I'd want to tell
mm,
my 21-year-old self that, because it's taken years to learn that in many
yeah.
ways, you know, that to think that, you know, what I'm trying to do is just serve God and give to God what I think that the church might need. And it might need it, it might not need it, but
Mm, yeah.
it might not need it now. Maybe it needs it in 2 decades. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But this is the calling I've been given, and that's enough. I guess I'd
Mm,
tell my 21-year-old self, like, it's enough
mm,
uh, to to really hear your calling and follow that.
mm,
I don't know.
mm.
I don't know. It's becoming therapy.
That's good. We could have a therapy session. We can just go on, do the next hour. We can do a therapy session. And then yeah. Speaking of like, just keep reading. Anything you've read lately or watched lately that you could
Hmm.
recommend?
Yeah, well, what have I been watching? I'm super intrigued. I'm almost caught up with For All Mankind on
Hmm.
Apple Plus. I just find it's fascinating, you
Yeah.
know. So people who haven't watched it, it's like a thought experiment, an alternate history, if you will, if the space race would have continued.
Yeah.
So there's 3 seasons, and the first one is like, you know, right around the Apollo missions, and what happens is Russia wins the race to the moon, and of course this compels the United States to stay more deeply invested, and then they jump forward. I think, what do they jump forward, like the 80s, and then they jump forward to the 90s, and it's really fascinating to think
Mm,
about what would happen. So I'm in the episodes now where it's 94, and like everything's kind of the same but different too. They do
Wow.
in a really
Yeah.
interesting way. And they're in 1994 and they're making it to Mars, so it's like the
Wow.
idea of what would have happened in the 70s, and particularly after the explosion of the a space shuttle,
Yep.
if things would have continued, what
Yeah.
would have occurred. So I'm finding that really interesting, kind of thinking that alternate history.
Yeah. Haven't started on season 2. Man, season 1 was really rough patch, and like a few episodes there. I mean, it was just some horrific loss and grief
Yeah.
that was hard for me to deal with. And then I got there, like the end of season 1 was just spectacular.
Yeah.
The way that they finish
Yeah.
seasons is pretty amazing.
It is pretty
Um,
amazing.
and
Yeah.
I've heard that the rest of it, as it was in season 1, is probably a slow go in season 2 for a while, builds
Yeah.
it up, but season 2 ends spectacularly as
It
well.
does. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I should probably catch back up. That'd be
Yeah.
good.
There's so much, talk about acceleration. There's so much to watch,
Yeah.
so
You can't keep up.
mm-mm,
I mean, you just can't keep up the
it's
conversation.
impossible. Yeah.
It's sad.
Yeah. But it's, we are living in the golden era of TV, so we also have
It's
to be
true.
appreciative for that. Yeah.
It's true. It's
Yeah.
true. Great. Where can people find your work? Anything that you want to say, hey, look out for?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of you to ask about the book coming out in at the end of September. So the Church After Innovation, and then people. I mean, I have a website, just andrewroot.org, that is getting revamped as we speak, which is kind of cool. And you can find me there, and you can also find me on that terrible dumpster fire called Twitter too. But I'm rarely on that. But I shouldn't say I'm rarely. I'm looking at like sports tweets all the
Yeah.
time. But try to not read much else for the sake
There
of
you
myself.
go.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, Andy, it was such a pleasure to have you on and to have this conversation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.